I'm not going to talk about the hiatus. I'm not going to talk about the hiatus. Okay, fine. My bad, folks. The 1 week break turned into 3 weeks. It's been a busy travel season. I'm taking some extra classes for professional development. And believe it or not, I have finally broken ground on my book. If you're tuning in and you've been part of any of my discussions on measuring the unmeasurable and developing meaningful key performance indicators for safety, you're in luck. A book is on its way. At some point. I'll keep you posted. Also, I probably felt a little too confident about how we solved all the world's problems on the last episode, and I really just wanted that to stew for a bit. If you missed it, go back and check out episode 210. Anyway, I got a little reprieve right now to get some content created, so let's jump right in. It's an all-new Prove It To Me. Welcome back to Prove It To Me. I'm your host, Dr. Matt Law. We are rolling into episode 211, and today we have a fascinating one. This is a topic that is incredibly close to home for me. If you've followed my work, you know I spent years researching occupational risk perceptions among foreign-born construction workers right here in Central Florida for my doctoral study. So, whenever a new paper drops about how we measure and quantify the way workers perceive hazards, I am all over it. But before we dive in, I have to give a quick shout out to my good friend Wyatt Bradbury for sending this paper my way. Now, Wyatt calls himself a listener of the podcast, which, if you know Wyatt, is a bit of a stretch. He's a listener in the sense that he self-admittedly never actually listens to the episodes. Instead, he waits until the weekend, and I end up giving him the lowdown over the phone while I enjoy a glass of bourbon. You all might remember him from our 2025 year in review back on episode 117. Wyatt, if you are actually listening to this, which you aren't, thank you for the recommendation. I'll catch you this weekend to explain it to you. All right, let's get into the research. The paper we are looking at today is titled Understanding Construction Workers' Risk Perception Using Neurophysiological Responses. It was published in the Journal of Computing in Civil Engineering in 2024 by a research team out of Purdue University. Now, I want to take our time with this one because the premise is brilliant, the science is dense, and the intent behind it is something I have a ton of respect for. We're going to do a deep dive into how they conducted this study, look at their findings, and then because this is Prove It To Me, we're going to put it through a highly critical, no BS reality check to see if this is something we can actually use in the field. Let's get to it. Now, I want to set the stage here. Why was this study conducted in the first place? Well, the construction industry has a massive problem, and it's not a secret to anyone listening. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, the number of fatal injuries in the construction sector climbed by 32.4% between 2011 and 2020. Despite all our safety training, all our site inspections, and all our toolbox talks, the trend is going the wrong way. There is this assumption that part of this comes down to situational awareness and something called inattentional blindness. Inattentional blindness is a cognitive failure where a worker might be looking right at a hazard, but their brain doesn't actually register it because their attention is engaged in another task. We've historically focused on tracking whether a worker sees a hazard, but these researchers correctly pointed out that visual attention does not inherently indicate hazard identification. You have to actually perceive the risk to act on it. Now, in my own research, I relied on validated instruments like the Construction Worker Risk Perception, or COWRP scale, to quantify how workers perceive the probability and severity of a hazard. It's a great tool that relies on surveys, but these researchers at Purdue wanted to take it a step further. They asked, instead of relying on surveys to measure risk perception, what if we just scan their brains to see how they perceive the risk in real time? To pull this off, the researchers used a technology called functional near-infrared spectroscopy, or fNIRS for short. Now, I don't want to lose you in the weeds here, so let's keep the tech explanation simple. fNIRS is a non-invasive optical neuroimaging approach. It essentially shines near-infrared light into the scalp to measure changes in oxygenated and deoxygenated hemoglobin in your brain tissues. When a specific part of your brain works harder, blood flow to that area increases, and the fNIRS sensors pick up on that hemodynamic change. They opted for this over EEG because fNIRS has superior spatial resolution, meaning they could map the exact brain regions lighting up with much greater precision. Here is how the experiment worked. They didn't want to use standard low-quality virtual reality because it lacks ecological validity. So they went out to actual construction sites in the Washington, D.C. and Northern Virginia areas and recorded 6 different scenarios using an Insta360 1X camera. This camera has ultra-wide fisheye lenses and captures high-quality 360-degree video and audio. The scenarios included dynamic hazards like a struck-by incident with a concrete block, overhead crane operations, and fall hazards on ladders. They strapped HTC Vive Pro Eye VR headsets onto 30 actual construction workers, not college students, and put a bright wearable fNIRS skull cap on them. The headset had a 110-degree field of view, so the workers had to physically turn their heads and bodies to scan the environment, just like they would on a real job site. The workers would watch a 30-second scenario. The screen would go blank, and they had to verbally report the hazard they just saw. While this was happening, the fNIRS cap was pulling data from their brain cortices at 10 hertz. The researchers then took all this brain data and fed it into an automated machine learning program, testing 15 different classification algorithms to see which one could best predict if a worker was perceiving risk. The results were genuinely impressive for a lab setting. An algorithm called CatBoost crushed the competition, achieving a 90.3% accuracy rate in classifying whether a worker perceived the risk. But here is where the study gets really interesting. By tracking where the blood was flowing, they identified 4 distinct anatomical locations of the brain that lit up during risk perception: the prefrontal cortex, the frontal eye fields, the primary motor cortex, and the primary auditory cortex. The prefrontal cortex makes sense. That's decision-making and cognitive processing. The frontal eye fields control visual attention, and the motor cortex controls movement, which tracks perfectly since the workers were actively scanning a 360-degree environment. But the auditory cortex? That's the part of the brain responsible for perceiving sound. The researchers found a significant correlation indicating that workers were actively relying on auditory cues to figure out where a hazard was coming from so they could direct their visual attention to it. In one scenario, a worker drops a concrete brick on a scaffold and it breaks. The workers who successfully identified the hazard had much stronger and faster brain activation in their auditory cortex the second they heard that brick snap. The authors conclude that auditory perception has been massively underestimated in construction safety. They argue that if we want to improve situational awareness, we need to understand how visual and auditory cues work together in the brain. And honestly, they aren't wrong. The cognitive science here is incredibly sound, and I love seeing research that digs into how and why of human behavior. However, this is where we have to pivot, because if you read this paper and immediately think, great, let's buy some fNIRS caps and start monitoring our workers' brains to prevent accidents, you are going to be in for a very, very rough time. Let's do the reality check. As a researcher who has spent years diving into how construction workers perceive risk, I applaud this study. But as an EHS professional and someone who has actually spent time managing safety on real-world operations, I have to throw up a few massive red flags regarding the practical application of this technology. Let's start with the most obvious roadblock, the hardware. In the controlled environment of this study, workers wore a bright wearable fNIRS cap. This device uses 20 channels, including 10 transmitters, firing near-infrared light and 8 receivers catching the bounce back. To get accurate data, these transmitters and receivers have to be positioned flawlessly on the scalp. Now, imagine taking that piece of highly sensitive scientific equipment and trying to shove it underneath a hard hat on a 95-degree day in July, while a worker is sweating profusely, tying rebar, and moving their head constantly. The authors mention that fNIRS has low sensitivity to body movements, but there is a canyon of difference between a stationary worker wearing a VR headset in a lab and a guy working a jackhammer in the dirt. The physical interference of the hardware alone makes field application a complete non-starter for the foreseeable future. Next, we have to talk about time, specifically the latency issue. Construction hazards unfold in fractions of a second. The primary physiological metric being measured in this study is hemodynamic response, the physical flow of oxygenated blood into brain tissues. Well, guess what? Blood doesn't teleport. The researchers openly acknowledge that hemodynamic response has a latency effect of 5 to 10 seconds. Let that sink in. 5 to 10 seconds. I don't know about you, but if I'm out fishing in my John boat and I hear a gator splash near the hull, I don't need 5 to 10 seconds for my brain to tell me to reel in and move. In construction, a 5-second delay isn't a safety intervention. It's a post-incident autopsy report. My third major issue with the practical application of this is the messiness of real-world data. When I was doing my own doctoral study, dealing with the messy reality of the field meant navigating language barriers, translating instruments into Spanish, and wrestling with self-reported data. But these researchers had to use MATLAB toolboxes and bandpass filters just to strip out the physiological noises like the workers' breathing, their heart rates, and their blood pressure. Furthermore, the auditory cues in their VR videos were scrubbed with an intelligent wind reduction algorithm to perfectly balance the sound. Real job sites are chaotic. The audio environment is an unfiltered mess of diesel engines, impact drivers, and wind. Translating this heavily sanitized lab data processing into an edge computing device that lives on a worker's head in real time is a monumental software engineering hurdle. And finally, we get to the biggest paradox of the whole study, the auditory contradiction. One of the most fascinating findings was how heavily the brain relies on the auditory cortex to perceive risk. Hearing the sound of that breaking concrete brick triggered hazard recognition faster and stronger. Okay, so hearing is critical for spatial awareness and risk perception. I agree. But What is the one thing we require workers to do on almost every loud construction site? Put in hearing protection. There is a glaring real-world variable missing from this conversation. If auditory cues are that vital to the risk perception process in the brain, how does standard safety PPE impact a worker's neurological ability to identify hazards? If a worker is wearing heavy muffs or foam plugs, are we artificially inducing inattentional blindness because their auditory cortex isn't getting the stimulus it needs to tell the frontal eye fields where to look? That is the question I want to see answered in the next study. All right, so we've torn apart the practical application of the tech, but I don't want to leave you with just a critique. There is immense value in understanding why humans do what they do, and this paper gives us some great insights we can apply without needing to buy a single brain scanner. Here are your practical takeaways for this week. Number 1, you don't need a brain scanner to understand your workforce's vulnerabilities. In my doctoral study, I found that demographic factors like birthplace and age have a statistically significant relationship with how a worker perceives risk on the job. We know risk perception is a leading indicator of injuries and fatalities, and it can be improved through targeted, culturally appropriate training. Talk to your people, understand their backgrounds, and tailor your safety communication to bridge those gaps organically. Number 2, look critically at your PPE. Obviously, we must protect our workers' hearing. That is non-negotiable, but we need to be smart about it. Are you over-attenuating? If a worker only needs a 15 noise reduction rating plug for their exposure, don't force them into a 33 NRR muff that completely isolates them from their environment. Consider active listening or level-dependent hearing protection that blocks harmful impact noise but allows ambient voices and environmental cues to pass through. You are protecting their eardrums, but you are also feeding their auditory cortex the data it needs to keep them situationally aware. Number 3, beware the shiny object syndrome. In my day job, I deal with a lot of safety technology, and I see this all the time. Vendors will take a concept like neuromonitoring, wrap it in a slick sales pitch, and try to sell you a wearable device that promises to predict accidents before they happen. This study is a perfect reminder that just because the science is valid in a pristine, climate-controlled laboratory does not mean it is ready for the mud, sweat, and chaos of a Tuesday morning concrete pour. That is going to do it for episode 211. Wyatt, if you are listening, I hope you enjoyed the summary. I'll expect you to buy the first round next time we meet to pay me back for reading the whole paper. If you folks got something out of today's conversation, please take a second to rate and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your shows. It truly is the best way to help other safety professionals find this information and keep our industry moving forward. Be sure to check out the show notes for a link to the original Purdue University study, as well as a link to my doctoral study on risk perceptions, if you want to dig into the data yourself. As always, if you have research you want to share, a topic you want torn apart, or if you just want to argue with me about how I interpret academic studies, send me an email at contact@proveitpod.com. Until next time, I'm Dr. Matt Law. Stay safe, keep asking the right questions, and I'll catch you on the next one. Prove It To Me is produced by me, Matt Law. Original music by Wes London. You can find this podcast on Podbean, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon Music, and iHeartRadio. Like what you've heard so far? Please like, subscribe, and follow wherever you get your podcasts, and leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Got questions about what we talked about or research that you want to share? Send an email to contact@proveitpod.com. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the host and its guests and do not necessarily represent the official position, opinion, or strategies of their employers or companies. Examples of research and data analysis discussed within this podcast are only examples. They should not be utilized in the real world as the only solution available, as they are based on very limited, often single use case, and sometimes dated information. Assumptions made within this discussion about research and data analyses are not necessarily representative of the position of the host, the guests, or their employers or companies. No part of this podcast may be reproduced, stored in a retrieval system, or transmitted in any form or by any means, mechanical, electronic, recording, or otherwise, without prior written permission of the creator of the podcast. The presentation of the content by the guests does not necessarily constitute an active endorsement of the content by the host. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, Damn it, Wyatt.